Okay, thank you everyone for attending this pitch paper presentation. I'll be presenting my work titled Using Guessability Framework, Age-Related Differences in Hand Gesture Interaction. I'm a master's student in Human-Computer Interaction Lab of the Computer Science Department in the University of Manitoba under the supervision of Professor Rani. And this research specifically presents differences in preferences for mid-air hand gestures in the smart home context between older and younger adults. So first, I'll briefly go through some background. Smart homes automate home appliances, enabling remote control of the entire household system. Another technological concept that is increasingly studied within this context leverages human natural mid-air hand gestures to provide a touchless manipulation of digital content or remote devices, and generally meant to replace the traditional mice and keyboards we are so used to. So this can potentially provide a great benefit to older people so they can possibly extend their independent lifestyle. So to create usable hand gesture interface, a technological design plays here a crucial role in adoption of the actual hand gestures, because we basically need to find gestures that are meaningful, easy to perform, are memorizable, and easy to recall for the majority of people, which is generally hard to accomplish. This means that we need to identify the gesture that can be suitable for everyone. So usually this thing is tackled using a traditional elicitation study where you basically engage end users, you show them the action, and then ask them to propose gesture they would use to trigger this action. Then you find the gesture that receives the highest number of votes, which are called most mentioned. And all goes fine, but eliciting gestures becomes more complex when we include the age groups as a factor. This is called an age-inclusive design then, when in generally means we need to ensure that technology X actually truly suits all the considered age groups. And bright good examples of age-inclusive design in general in our day-to-day life is entrances adapted for wheelchairs, graphical elements, increased size of graphical elements, color adjustments on the screen, as well as subtitles in the movies. So here's how age is supposed to make a difference for gesture performance. A variety of physiological changes that occur as age are associated with a decline in sensory, perceptual, motor, and cognitive abilities. However, everyone ages differently, and the changes cannot be exclusively defined in terms of being above or below a certain age limit. This is called heterogeneity of aging. And genetics, cultural background, lifestyle, all these shape the effect of age to an individual. And since hand gestures literally imply a specific physical motion of the hand, this motion could require certain levels of force, dexterity, precision, and coordination of the hand. And here designing hand gesture interface becomes more complicated since you basically cannot predict the degree of changes that occur to an individual. So for that reason, existing related works suggest a calibration technique when it comes to adjusting for mostly ROM, range of motions, and velocity of the gesture movements between younger and older adults based on their comfort level, basically. So the problem here is that the majority of existing studies that were trying to learn more about older adults and gesture interaction always used predefined gestures that were predefined by human-computer interaction professionals and used the same sets of gestures for both younger and older adults. While there are numerous works studying user-defined hand gestures, we don't really know much about user-defined gesture preferences in the population of older adults. The second thing is that the existing guidelines or related works are only saying that there is obviously a difference between older and younger adults in terms of range of motions and velocity of the movement, suggesting to calibrate for that. But no studies have measured those actual differences so that we could visually observe the numerical metrics and results. So with that in mind, in our research, we wanted to actually elicit the gestures from different age groups and explore a bit of actual metrics that could be used to evaluate differences in mid-air hand gesture. So the research questions we constructed, we were interested to know is, would user-defined gestures be different between older and younger adults, and how different the gestures would be in terms of velocity, acceleration, force, gesture, space, spatial preference, range of motions, and which all these properties will be elaborated in the next slides. So we designed a study in which 12 younger adults and older adults were recruited to participate in the traditional gesture elicitation study. The younger participants were all students, and the older adults were all healthy, independent individuals. To address the research questions, we extracted a set of user-defined gestures for 10 common smart home interactions, such as turning on TV, changing the channel, etc. And in the meantime, we leveraged the opportunity during this solicitation study and track the participants' motions by a Kinect depth sensor and a variable electromyography armband that consists of EMG, electromyography, in IMU sensors. We ended up having measured gestures motions such as ranges of motions, velocity, acceleration, and levers of exerted force generated by the forearm muscles during those gesture motions. So next couple of slides will present the results of the study. Note that all the results were calculated separately for the group of younger and older adults. So first of all, we extracted a total of 521 gestures, where 247 were unique. So which tells that older adults were proposed 26% more unique gestures than younger adults. Also, we have used agreement rates and max consensus metrics to calculate statistical agreement that suggests that older adults proposed more ideas for the gesture so that they had less agreement to prefer a uniform gesture than younger adults. However, when we extracted most mentioned gestures, which are the ones that were proposed the biggest number of times, we have seen that both older and younger adults' gesture sets were surprisingly 70% similar, offering only 30% of the tasks. Different only 30% of the tasks. So suggesting that although older adults might have wider preference or choice for the hand gestures ideas, they still converge to the same ideas as the younger adults. Next, we'll extract the mean velocity and acceleration of the gesture motions from the Kinect and Myo armband data. We split them into the three axes: left-right direction movements, front-to-back direction movements, and upward-downward direction movements, where no significant difference were found between the groups. So then we calculated the area under the curve of the root mean square of the EMG signal during the gesture execution and normalized it by a commonly used submaximal voluntary contraction, which implied, based on the results, no group effect was found, which means that there's no difference in the force that was exerted during the execution of the gestures between two groups. Now, novel for the research in Asian-inclusive hand gesture design was capturing participants' wrist in 3D space that resulted in an understandable visualization of space occupied by the gesture motions represented as an arbitrary 3D shape consisted of the 3D data points that can also be called polygon, 3D polygon, or polyhedron. The resultant polyhedrons were of different volumes and a different spatial location. The 3D data points of these polyhedrons were further processed into the heat map from black in a black, red, yellow spectrum, showing the distribution of hand motions, where black color implies the densest regions and yellow means the least dense regions. Supplementing the previous slide, here we have calculated the total volume of all those polyhedrons separately for all the older and younger participants. And there was an obvious significant difference, and younger adults almost doubled the space used by their gesture movements as opposed to the older adults. Since there was a different shape, the polyhedrons were of different shape and spatial locations, we just got naturally interested. We wanted to know somehow formalize and visualize this information. So for that, we mapped those polyhedrons to a gesture space division layout proposed by McNeil, which essentially splits the space around the user into subdivision in a frontal space plane. As you can see there's a visual difference where for young adults, you can observe motions moving towards left and upper division, while for older adults, you can observe that motions were more concentrated in the center division only. So note that the picture are mirrored, and this is the diagram only, and the diagram only shows one view, frontal view. Lastly, during the experiment, we observed that older adults tended to keep their hands closer to their body, namely chest and torso, keeping it within the body frame, the frame of their body, while young adults did not show any particular preference. They were utilizing pretty much all the space around them with no blind spots. So Discussion. According to our results, older adults mostly did not really differ from younger adults, surprisingly, in terms of physical properties of the gestures, as compared to the previous works. Maybe aging does not particularly affect people hand gesture preferences as much as we thought it does. We can say that for independent older adults, those who are less than 25 years old, the gesture preferences are not that different compared to younger adults. Therefore, similar gestures can be designed for both, regardless of age. Although the gesture sets were similar, the agreement rates could possibly be used to distinguish the age effect of different age groups. Interestingly, the bigger the difference in agreement rates between the groups is, the bigger the gap in user-defined gestures, which were generated subliminally to meet all the physical comfort level requirements of an individual. And um, lastly, older adults tend to keep their hands closer to their body, limiting the utilized space and the special location of their user-defined gestures. So why would they do it? If they just choose to do it, maybe this is a common cognitive age-related factor that affects both the gesture ideas and the gesture physical properties. However, if they do it because it is physically more comfortable, then again, there has to be something common in their physical limitations, which should be explored in future works. In conclusion, we looked at the age effect of user-defined mid-air hand gesture preferences in smart home context, for which we conclude that elicitation technique is a good framework for this purpose, since it allows to test and compare any required properties of the user gestures between any sample groups. Generalizability. Our results generalizability is limited to the range of conditions in only healthy and independent older adults. So to further research with older adults who either have specific cases of significant age effect or live in dedicated institutions and heavily dependent on the other people is required. Also, there might be other dimensions and variables which correlate with age in a similar or even more direct manner that can increase reliability of the age-related metrics of the gesture preferences, and further exploration is required. Thank you so much for your time. If you have any questions.
Thank you for your presentation, Yurii. It was very concise. It was perfect. So do we have any question on the chat room? Let me check. I don't think so. I will just have like a quick question for you, Yurii. Can you explain or tell us a little bit more about the future work of this project?
In terms of what I mentioned?
Yeah.
So as I mentioned here in the previous slides, so future works could be a good idea in terms of looking at wider range of people, since we've only managed to look at healthy individual independent older adults that were able to come to the lab and take part in their experiments, but essentially the range of their capabilities might seem not to really be different compared to any younger individual. But if we look at the different spectrum of the older adults, aging might affect them worse. I mean, differently. And we noticed that so the range of our participants was 75 years old. So we didn't have anyone older than that. So the age might also have a particular influence of that. So after 75 years old, the aging effect might completely differ the results. So the future works should include other groups of older people in such studies, and further analysis of such metrics that we attempted to do should be performed, since we never expected to see a different spatial preferences of the gestures. like if when you looked at those polyhedrons, they were completely different, and they were in quite different location, and maybe it was not as much visible on the graph on that picture, but it was indeed very different if you would see it alive. Whether there might be other variables that are similar to this one there that future works should include, and I think this is the point I mentioned in my discussion.
Thank you, Yuri. You have coding that share a reference for you, so please go read this paper if you want.